If you could eliminate a disaster every 10 days in your shop, you will do it.
Failures that are costing people
tens of thousands of dollars.
To idle or not idle, is that what we're talking about?
You need to go do an actual test, collect real data, and then let the data speak to you. I just will see more in a week than most people will in their lifetime. To test one diesel oil is over $1 million.
Everybody, welcome. This is episode number 2 of the Builders Lounge, and we have a very special guest and a great friend of ours, Lake Speed Jr. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's really an honor for us to have you here. I'll give you a quick introduction, but also a co-host here and the owner, Dave himself.
I got a promotion. I'm co-host. Do I get a raise? I need some more money, bro.
We'll have to talk about that later.
But listen, before you get into all of Lake's extensive background, let's just say, how lucky are we that the man has come from Tennessee?
North Carolina,
all the way from the East Coast just to be here with us. So thank you very much, Lake.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
We are so honored that you made the journey. So now get to the highlights of who this guy is.
Well, I told Lake, I said, if I miss anything, you make sure to correct me. But we know you as a tribologist. I think you can say it a few different ways. But essentially for everybody out there, Lake will explain that in a minute, but that is an expert on all things friction, oil, wear, all of that stuff. We'll have to show everybody your shirt because it literally says...
Yeah, the guy's loud and proud right there. Read it. There you go, everybody.
Okay, and then also you have a huge background because of your father with NASCAR, racing, everything like that. You also had a big part with Driven Racing Oil and Joe Gibbs Racing, developing those lubricants. You started your company, SPEEDiagnostix,
Yep.
which we use. I think a lot of our customers use your oil analysis because it's phenomenal. But then you've also spoke, if anybody's watched the Engine Expo, been at PRI, SEMA, NORIA, PRA, all of those huge events, if they get a chance to have you be there, it's an honor, just like it is to have you here. So a lot of previous background speaking. You also have your own YouTube channel. You're on Total Seal, the Motor Oil Geek. You're everywhere on social media, I feel like.
Yeah, if it has an acronym in the automotive world, Lake is there.
Yeah,
talking about oil.
Well, I love tribology.
Yeah,
it's wonderful. I mean, to be honest, I've been really blessed, right? I got hired by Coach Gibbs to go be part of Joe Gibbs Racing and be part of their oil program at a time when they weren't even selling the product yet. But it was something we were using tribology as a competitive advantage to win races and championships in NASCAR. So when we literally spent $10 million in 8 years developing better products.
Wow.
Just to eke out another tenth of a second or another horsepower or longevity or whatever it takes to win.
So the fun story is this. So the 8 years prior to, using tribology as an advantage in NASCAR, Joe Gibbs Racing had won 16 races and 0 championships. In the 8 years following, they won 84 races and 5 championships.
Yeah, wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a huge increase.
So I was the lucky guy that got to be part of that.
Yeah.
And so I just feel like I've been blessed with an incredible opportunity to have worked with amazing people, learn all kinds of wonderful stuff. And I'm like, man, I was that same guy that didn't know what a 2050 really was. I didn't really understand what synthetic oil was, or zinc or ZDP or any of these things, and bought additives and put additives in my oil because I thought that must make it better. Man, I was that guy before going to work at Joe Gibbs Racing and working with the guys at Lubrizol and doing all this stuff. So I feel like it's my mission in life is to give back, to help my former self and all the people who were like me that cared about their car, that wanted to do the best, that wanted to have good longevity, good performance, good fuel, all the stuff. Well, how do you get there? Well, I've been there. I can tell you how to get there. So yeah, I go and speak at all the different places and do all these different videos and things to try to show people the way to do these things that we know works because we've proven that it works.
Right. And I want to reiterate what you just said for the whole audience out there is that's what you're here for. And that's really what we want to suck out of your brain today is why is oil important? First off, how cold starts. That's a big trigger word for, I think, some people out there.
Trigger word. Trigger. Nah.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about
idle or not idle. Is that what we're talking about?
To idle or not to idle? That's the question. So we're going to talk about that. And really, you're going to help educate us and a lot of people out there that are watching this to learn and better understand that. And also fuel. What's the important role there? We've got some show and tell here about different ignition issues. So there's a lot that we're going to cover that's been a lot of, I don't know if controversy is the right word on social media, but
controversy is a good word. Yeah.
Because
it's a
it
good
is
point.
out there.
When you say controversy and, when people, sometimes people call them haters. I like to call them creators. They're just doing it in a different way than what we're doing it. I don't like to use the word hate, although sometimes it can feel like that. But what I like about it is I've used it my whole life to go kind of like, okay, am I the one that's thinking flat earth here? Or if that person is maybe thinking flat earth, what can I do to bring to the table with a discussion and education to maybe change their mind or educate myself and change my own mind? That's what, anytime I'm talking to anybody that knows me, it's about, okay, teach me and they educate me, and then let's learn from that. And when we're talking about engines and oil and stuff like that, for me, it's longevity, durability, and performance.
And as Lake, this has to be your term, or unless you got it from somebody else. But let's talk about the science,
not the speculation.
Not speculation.
Yeah. That's been my mission. Like since I met the guys at Lubrizol, I will never forget when we were working with those guys. So people don't know, there's all these different brands of fuel and oil. I mean, there's thousands of brands around the planet. There's only 4 companies that actually make the additives that go into every brand of fuel and every brand of oil.
Wow.
Lubrizol, Afton, Chevron Ornite, and Infinium. Infinium's a joint venture between Shell and ExxonMobil.
Huh.
Those are it. Those are the guys who make the chemical packages that get blended into the fuel, they get blended into all the different oils, transmission fluids, gear oils, engine oils, all that stuff. Those are the guys that do the real testing. So when Joe Gibbs Racing was working with Lubrizol to develop these products, and I was able to go meet these guys and go through some of their employee training programs, and when they started teaching me about what the reality of lubricants and fuels and things were, I was blown away because they were challenging every preconceived notion that I had grown up with.
Right.
That's what I mean by the flat earth. People need to be challenged on their beliefs, because sometimes it's just like grandpa told them to do that.
Right. A lot of it is, well, this is the way that my dad did it and my grandpa did it. And
I understand that. I had a grandpa and a dad, and I look back at some of this stuff. Let me give you an example. This is truth. And my dad's, grandpa's passed away, so he can't get
feelings hurt.
He can't get in trouble for this. When we lived, grew up in the Keys in Florida, and this is how, when you changed your oil, this is what you did. The oil came out of the ground. Where did you put the oil when you drained it out of
back in the ground?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Now, I know people who did that.
That was not that uncommon. You had a place in your yard that a post hole digger.
I did not know this.
Okay. That's not uncommon 50, 60 years ago.
Not in the South.
And and that's where I grew up.
Wow.
And so that was kind of one of those things like, well, it came out of the ground, boy, that's where we're going to put it back. And then, it'll get down in there and we'll recycle it again.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's an example of what grandpa told you to do.
It is organic. It will decompose.
Well, but millions of years.
but to your guys' point, I mean, that's the concern. And that's why we want the science, not speculation, because a lot of people are saying, well, this is the way it should be done, because it seems like common knowledge. That's what people do. I mean, that's right.
Well, I'd say there's two paths that people go down. to come up with their conclusions. One, they either have this, we'll call it tribal knowledge, it's been passed down. This is
That's what
you know,
we're
this is
talking
what you
about.
do, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Or they've looked at data sheets and they've theorized something. They've come up with their idea based on looking at data and say, okay, this is what it is. But that may not always be actual, right? That sometimes your theoretical isn't what happens in the real world.
Right.
So if you need to go do an actual test, control the variables, collect real data from that application, and then let the data speak to you and tell you what it is.
Right.
And I mean, I think most of what happens out there is the tribal knowledge that's been passed down from generation to generation. The first example that I came across when I was at Gibbs and working with the guys at Lubrizol was break-in. So you want to blame me, the whole break-in oil, we were the first ones to sell that.
Oh.
That was, I'll say it was my idea. Because what they wanted to sell was the race oil.
Mm-hmm.
And just somewhere instinctively in me, I knew, I'm like, wait, there's only so many race cars. I mean, we can, yeah, that's great. If the race oil works great for race cars, fantastic. But man, there's a lot of engines being built.
Right.
The fact that we had this special break-in oil, to me, that was way more fascinating than the race oil. We've been using race oil for years.
Right.
In working for NASCAR stuff.
Not everybody uses race oil.
But having a purpose-built break-in oil, well, that's different.
Yeah.
This is something unique. I want to know what's the story with that. And when they explained the engineering behind it, and I looked at the test results and the data, where we went from losing 1 in 10 new flat Tappet camshafts to none just by changing oil.
Yeah.
We were like, whoa. I mean, 1 in 10 may not seem like much, but when you're building 9 engines a week, that's one almost every week. And that's a $50,000 race motor. And anybody that knows lots of flat Tappet cam, it's not you just pull the cam out and put another one in.
No, it's
a nightmare.
It's a nightmare because all that metal's just circulated everywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a disaster.
It is a disaster.
So it's like if you could eliminate a disaster every 10 days in your shop, you will do it.
Yeah.
So I'm like, wait, this stuff is like special. But what's interesting is if you looked at the chemistry of that, back to the science, it was like, well, we had data, but let's understand the science of why. Well, it goes back to the old days of everyone told you growing up to break in a new engine, you needed straight 30 weight, non-detergent oil.
Yes.
Well, people then thought, okay, it has something to do with being straight 30 weight. Nope, that wasn't it. Oh, it's non-detergent. Nope, that's not what it is. What the reality was, the straight 30 non-detergent oil back in the day, not now, don't go to the parts store and go buy non-detergent oil, it's junk.
Right.
But back in the day, it still had zinc in it. It had ZDP in it, but no detergent. So the detergents actually compete against the ZDP. So what it did, it had the correct balance. It had ZDP, it had anti-wear with the right balance that it could do the job. That's why it worked way back in the day.
Right.
But today, non-detergent oils don't have any additives in them. They're like literally nothing. So that's not good.
Right. Yeah,
And
you need something.
You need something, right? So working with the guys at Lubrizol, they were like, okay, here, we need the ZDP to be active. We need to get this camshaft to break in properly. So we need to have EP properties. We need to have anti-wear. We need all the stuff. And they did that in that package. And I'm like, this is special. This is way more special than just another synthetic oil.
Yeah.
And then that's where break-in oil came from.
Yeah.
And then it took over and we sold it all around the world. But that was one of the big myths you had to overcome. It's like, no, you actually want this 15W50 oil is going to do a better job. Straight 30 had nothing to do with it. You put in your bottle of additive in there, will not take the detergent out.
Yeah.
So that brings up a good question that I think maybe a lot of people have is if their engine should take a 1540 or a 540 or a 020, should they use that type of oil, that viscosity, with an additive, or should they use? It's because it sounds like a 30 weight isn't really
good for your lawnmower, I think, is about it.
Oh, that's a whole nother ball of wax, right? Talk about stirring up the pot. Lawnmower guys and their straight 30 weight oils. I mean, that might be a video on my channel one day.
But so what should they use they should continue to use whatever viscosity the manufacturer recommends, and then just find a break-in oil for that viscosity?
Yeah, that's one reason why, back to my time at Gibbs, we actually came up with everything from a 520 all the way to a 2050 break-in oil. That way, if you had an engine and the bearing clearances were such that you needed to run, say, a 520, well, there was a 520 break-in oil for that.
Right.
We had a 530, we had a 1040, we had a 2050. So you could match up the right viscosity for the bearing clearances, because that's the key. Bearings need to have the right viscosity. You need to have the proper flow. If you have too much flow across the bearing, right, the oil is too thin for the bearing clearance, you're not going to be able to build the hydrodynamic wedge properly. So you're going to end up with more bearing wear, and no one wants that.
Right.
But on the flip side, if you put in too thick of an oil, it won't flow across the bearing well enough, and it won't cool it properly. And I've seen that happen too, right? So it's, Goldilocks and the Three Bears is my go-to analogy for almost everything chemical related.
Well, here we go.
Yeah.
I can't wait.
You're an analogy guy. This is perfect.
I'm like,
what was it, right? They didn't want it too hot. They didn't want it cold. Just right. You don't want too much. You don't want too little. You want it just right. So that's where people typically go wrong in a lot of this stuff. That they find that maybe they were off a little bit, so maybe they added something and it moved in the right direction. Well, they think, well, if a little is good, well, more must be better. No, typically not. You can go to a point of an extreme where it flips back over, back to ZDP. If you put too much ZDP in your oil, it will actually increase wear.
Yeah, before we go there, because I remember you talking about that. I just want to, we talk about braking on our engines now, and we don't really need, as I think we have spoke about this. We run our engines up on our sim test, and we've got a break-in oil in that, 50, 60 gallons or something is in that sump.
Yeah, quite a bit.
And we've got triple filtration on it and everything, But by the time I put that engine in that truck or a car for a guy, because of a shout out here to Mark Malberg, has taught us, cylinder wall finish and things like that. By the time that motor is put in the car and fired up, as I understand it, I'm as broken as I'm going to get within a minute. I mean, really, maybe 500 cycles of that piston going up and down that wall. I'm as broken as I'm ever going to get. Am I wrong in that?
So we did some testing with my good buddy Billy Godbold from Comp Cams. We wanted to find out, how long does it actually take for a flat Tappet camshaft to break in?
Yeah,
is it 20 minutes?
And we're talking about
30 minutes.
We're talking about good steel here, not cheap steel.
No, good stuff. Right. No, good stuff, right? We really studied this out, and we used a spintron, which basically can spin the valve train separately from the rest of the engine.
Right.
And we used profilometer, and we used what's called an ADCOL, so we could measure all 16 cam lobes. And we actually went in various stages and time cycles, and measure it before, measure it after, and all this. A flat Tappet camshaft breaks in 3 minutes.
Wow.
I think we've always said about 2 minutes, getting it up to a certain RPM.
Yeah.
3 minutes is...
3 minutes is done. It will live or die in the first 3 minutes.
Yeah.
And what will make it live or die? So a right amount of DDP.
The first is contact geometry. Okay. So that's the best thing. It's like mentioning Mark.
Yeah.
If you have an improper surface finish, there's no amount of zinc that can fix bad geometry or poor surfaces.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, it might help it. It may take some of this borderline and make it passable. But if you have completely bad geometry, if you have completely trash surface finish, there's no amount of zinc that can fix it.
Yeah, right. Just for people out there that, are listening to this and don't build engines for a living, on the geometry, what we're talking about is lobe, how the lifter sits on the lobe And then surface finish is the roughness average, the depth of, the oil retention in that surface of the lifter, and the cam lobe itself, just to kind of make you understand that if we want that lifter on a flat Tappet not to be just stuck, it needs to rotate on that lobe.
Yeah. I think we've done a video of that before with the valve train geometry.
Right.
We had a cam that was not spinning one of the lifters. It was just, it would almost rotate it, but not enough.
Yeah.
And
that means it will go flat.
Yeah.
And we went through 3 cams.
Yeah, this was an old Toyota engine or something that we had a really hard time
I think it was an
finding.
old FJ or something like that. We don't do many of them, and we saw that, we caught that, and by the time we got to the 3rd cam,
so here's a fun story about geometry.
Mm-hmm.
Norris Marshall at Blueprint Engines. For years they built, flat Tappet cam engines,
right?
And they had to get all their blocks. Were all salvage yard blocks or reclaimed cores.
Yeah.
So all your lifter geometry was all basically at the mercy of whatever was out there. And of course, they struggled with flat tap break-in stuff like everybody else did, right?
Yeah.
For years and years and years. Well, they stopped making those cores a long time ago. And so the core quality was going down and everything. So they decided they were going to start making their own blocks so they could be able to keep up the demand.
Right.
I've heard that.
Once they started making their own blocks, and then they had full control over the lifter board geometry, guess how many flat Tappet camshaft failures they've had since they've made their own blocks?
I'm going to say less than 2%.
That'd be 0.
0.
Wow.
So
none.
Wow.
None. Because, of course, they have everything else right.
Right.
Because they've been beating their heads about checking lobes and flat Tappets and the zinc. They've got all the other stuff down pat. They know it now. But once you got the geometry right, where that lifter sits correctly.
Over the top of
Over the top. Offset just the right amount so that it will spin.
Right.
Yeah.
None.
Wow. That's interesting.
So I guess what you're saying is it really, a lot of times we want to just point the finger at somebody else.
Right.
And that somebody else is usually bad camshaft. There was I've done it myself. I'm like, start up a car, and you're right. You usually know, the thing will run fine.
Oh, your butt's puckered for 2 or 3 minutes.
2 or 3 minutes. But you're out of the woods after you got about 5 minutes of that thing, and it's not popping up through the intake or anything like that. You're thinking, okay, I'm good here. But so what you're saying is most likely, I don't Renshaw probe all the old 350s, but if a guy's got one and he still wants me to build it, I will do that, and I will come back to him and say, the only way I'm going to warranty this motor is if we, bushing those lifters, because they are all over the place.
Yeah.
And so I have done that for that exact reason, is because the cores that you get now or that are still around, it's all over the place.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I think we should dive in maybe now to cold start.
Oh,
you want to dive into that deep end?
Yeah. That's
I can hear, I can feel some of our audience being like, all right, let's get
to the good stuff. I made a statement, it's been a month ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, hey, this is how you should start up your diesel truck. Clean the windshield off, start it up, get out, scrape the windshield because you don't
warm up the glow plugs.
Yeah, warm up the glow plug.
Whatever it may be.
Fire it up. But, give it 15, 20, 30 seconds and get in it and then drive it, and just drive it like a normal person. I want to stress that. I didn't say,
qualifying lap at Indy 500. No, I'm not doing that.
Don't go out there and hole shot the thing, but just drive it nice, just drive it nice. And that you can get more heat into the engine. And I assume that people would just kind of fall and, believe that, because it's like, okay. Then people came back. I want to say this. A lot of people kind of bolstered my argument, and they didn't even realize it, because they'd say, well, why does my truck have a high idle on it and stuff like that? And I was like, exactly.
Because someone's looking out for you.
Well, you're creating more combustion cycles. That doesn't mean that it's a bad thing to take it from 1,200 to maybe 18 to 2,500 and back down to 15 and back up to 25. When you're driving normally, getting on the freeway to go to work or something like that. And, I'll tell you, I don't think I've ever said anything that was fraught with more everybody thought it was crazy. In fact, I think we've got some video. People sending me like an old Detroit and the engine's still running. There's a hole in the side of the block, and guys would say, well, I guess I let it idle too long, Dave, and stuff like that, And I'm thinking maybe that didn't have a dang thing to do with it, dude. Maybe it's because that motor's 60 years old. I don't know.
Well, I think it led us to question our own selves, because we've been interviewed by some local radio stations years ago,
right?
And they asked us, and I think somebody on the internet, somehow these guys found an old video of that interview.
I know my hair wasn't gray.
I know.
I had blonde hair back on that thing, dude.
But I think some people found an old video where you said the same thing on a news station, that it was like, no, get in it, turn it on, and go. Yeah,
this was on gas cars. People were asking me in the dead of winter, is it good? Should we just let the cars idle to heat up? And I was like, no.
Just go.
It loads up catalytic converters. It doesn't really put any heat into the oil, and you're just wasting fuel and you're going nowhere.
Well, and then that led us to do a recent video that we did different oil analysis.
Yes.
That we sent out to Lake to do a test. And so I guess that I'm transitioning over.
So let me explain the test.
Okay.
Yeah, because the test procedure is critical here.
Yes. Okay. So we had 4 samples. 2 of the samples are brand new. Stay with me here. So we got 1 brand new sample here, and then we cold cycle started that truck 3 times. So let me explain what I mean by that. We started it up cold, 30 degrees, showed it on the scan tool. Oil temp was 30, coolant temp was 30.
Did we show Did we show outside temperature?
Yeah, we showed all that, ambient temperature and all that. So we had, 25 to 30 degrees. I think on one of the tests, we got down to like 15 degrees. Now remember, this is Utah. This is not the Great White North or, Minnesota across the Great Lakes or something, some places that just get 40 below.
It's cold, but it ain't crazy cold.
It ain't crazy cold. So in my thinking, I was like, okay, this is the environment. This is what we should do. And I wanted to prove it. So I drive that. I'm sorry. The first one, I took a sample of just brand new clean oil, and we have the results here, and Lake's going to walk us through that in a minute. Then what I did with that brand new oil in that truck, it was a 2019 F350. And by the way, we had just replaced the entire fuel system on that truck because it had grenaded. It was in here for a CP4 pump that grenaded. So new injectors, new lines, flush the tank, new CP, the whole thing.
Yeah, DCR kit. Yeah.
We did a DCR conversion on it. So brand new fuel and the whole 9 yards. So then we started it up, idled it for 10 minutes, just sitting here in a parking lot, shut it down, let it get all cold again overnight, started it up the next morning, let it idle for 10 minutes, shut it down, next morning, started up 10 minutes. We did that 3 times. So 3 10-minute cycles with a cold soak in between those cycles. Then we tested that oil. I sampled that oil.
So now we have 2 tests.
Yeah, we have the brand new oil and the oil that has been idled 3 times with cold cycles. Then I took then I did the oil change. So I put brand new oil in it. Then we took that sample as a baseline. So we have those 2 brand new oils as a baseline. Then what I did is I drove the truck. I started up, let it idle for 15 seconds, put it in gear, and drove it for 10 minutes.
And how hard did you drive it, sir?
I drove it like your mother would drive it, not like I would drive it.
Okay.
Although I did drive it, but I made sure I drove it like your mother would drive it.
Not Formula One racer.
No, I mean, okay. and I don't want to ruin anybody's truck. So I mean, it's a cold engine. So, I just got on it easy and just put some heat into it. I drove the speed limit and just kind of was good. And we watched the scan tool. And within 2 or 3 minutes, I had surpassed what 10 minutes got me to idling on my oil temps and my coolant temps. And so I did that 3 times with cold soaks in between those 10 minutes of driving. And so now we sent that all to SPEEDiagnostix, and Lake's going to talk to us about those results. And I didn't know what it'd be because I thought I knew what it would be. I assumed that I knew from working on cars that I would be getting more heat into the engine by driving it, because I've obviously started a car up cold in the thing and watched the scan tool for different data. And I already knew that I would get more heat into it. But did I know that it would be Better for the engine.
Yeah, what we wanted to know was, did it negatively or positively impact the engine and wear?
Right. In my mind, and follow me here, Lake. In my mind, there's two arrows pointing in different directions. One arrow is how fast can we get the car heated up? Because people want,
they don't want to be freezing.
Yeah, they don't want to be freezing. That it's basically that's what a lot of people said that. My wife not getting into that car until that thing's warmed up. She's not going anywhere, and neither am I, and blah, 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 blah. And so we can talk about how to resolve that issue without wasting fuel and killing your engine. So that was the first one. How can we get more heat in the engine? But of course, what we really want as an engine builder is to not cause any harm. It's almost like a doctor. How can we do this without causing harm, without, causing more wear onto the engine? Or diluting fuel, or not diluting fuel, diluting the oil. Because another one of Lake's, another one of Lake's great sayings is, fuel is the enemy to oil.
Absolutely.
I'm giving you credit for that. I listened to you.
You stole the words out of my mouth.
Well,
that's what I was going to say.
They're your words. I'll give you credit. Fuel is the enemy to oil. And so if you're getting fuel down into the oil, that can't be a good thing.
It's not a good thing.
It's not a good thing. So with all that said, that's the test. That's how we did it.
So what's the science?
So what's the science, Lake?
Well, so what we were able to see between that, I call it a 0-hour sample. Your sample from the engine being changed to fresh oil to the engine being run, there was about a 40% difference in the amount of fuel in the oil. So by driving the car, not idling it, you had 40% less fuel in the oil.
40%.
Actually, slightly over 40. It's 42%.
So
less.
So let me emphasize
42%.
And that less oil or less fuel in the oil driving it versus idling it.
That's okay. We got to show everybody out there. This, guys, you need to be aware. Over 40%. We're talking 42% reduction. We're going to somehow edit this and put this up there for you guys to see that it doesn't make just a little tiny difference, not 1%, not 2%. We're talking a massive difference.
Yeah.
Can you go into depth with us about what you look for as somebody in a lab analyzing oil on just a regular basis? And also, can you educate us on what we're looking at here from our test subject?
Sure. So the best thing to do is to start at 30,000 feet and then move down. What some people get wrong with oil analysis is they start and they find one number and they look at that one number and either they say, oh, I'm good, or I'm bad. They freak out. You have to look at it in general. So a perfect example with like our idle versus driving.
Okay, so that everybody understands this table that we're looking at, sample 1 is essentially brand new, clean oil, freshly changed. And then the next section over is us idling 3 times. So we'll highlight that on those different days. Sample number 3, the next column over, is again, brand new, fresh oil. And then the 4th column over is cold start and just getting on it and driving it. So that's those breakdowns, and that's what we're really looking at here.
Okay, we're talking about the fuel dilution numbers, which is in 42% difference. But we can see that the big picture is, well, the viscosity was also lower with the idle time versus driving it. So they correlate together. So you're looking for relationships. As an oil analyst, that's what I'm looking at, is I'm looking at the relationships. So I'm looking at the new sample relative to the used sample. And now I'm also looking at the viscosity, because I know that the higher the fuel dilution is going to drive down viscosity. That's how I can be confident in these numbers. Because if the viscosity hadn't changed, but the fuel dilution had changed, then that doesn't make me very confident in my fuel dilution numbers.
You don't see any relationship or correlation.
Right. But when I see a correlation that, oh, I lost a whole centistoke of viscosity by idling it, or I lost about a half a centistoke of viscosity driving it, and that correlates well with the change in fuel dilution, that gives me confidence in my results. Because if you had just sent a sample of the 2 used ones and not the fresh ones, it's not as powerful.
Right.
So you're looking at big picture, then you're driving down.
Yeah.
That's the key to understanding oil analysis reports is you have to look big picture first. And that has to be what really tells you. Then as the analyst, then I can dig into the details and I can tell you where there's a difference here, or maybe there's corrective action that should be taken or something like that. That's big picture, then details. And that's where you get your guidance.
And what kind of difference will that make to the engine long term?
Yeah, we're talking 3 mornings. I mean, this is only 3 mornings. Now, winter happens. It depends on where you live, but if you're doing this months. 5 days a week for 4 or 5 months, and you've changed your oil before the winter, you're going to change it after the winter. How much damage have you actually done to your engine through diluting the oil by all that additional fuel into it, by idling your truck every morning or car for 10 minutes?
So let me jump from this to a real world example, because 2 days ago, I had to work with a customer that has a hybrid, and this first oil sample was really good. Everything was great because it was one taken from the summer, spring into summer driving, which was where he lived was, warm climate. So it was fine. But this last sample, same amount of miles, actually slightly higher viscosity oil. He went from a 0.16, which is what the car manufacturer said to use. He went to a 0.20 because he was worried about it being, too thin.
Right.
Now, for people watching who are saying, he's going up, changing viscosity from manufacturer is a bad thing. I'm like, no, that's not what got him, right? Hear me out. But what happened was, now he's in the wintertime, and it's a hybrid. And it's cold. And now the engine's running intermittently.
Yeah, on, off.
Right.
Yeah.
What happened was his fuel dilution doubled.
Oh my gosh, doubled.
And now there's 0.5% of water. So yes, his wear metals more than doubled.
Wow.
The amount of wear more than doubled, but it was based on the fact that the fuel dilution had gone up and the water had gone up.
Well, the water goes up because of the condensation in the motor. We're doing that heat, cold.
Which is why we're back to this.
Yeah.
Right? When you're not getting temperature in the engine, every combustion cycle, gas or diesel, makes water.
Right.
So you're going to get more water and fuel in the oil. And our hybrid example we were just talking about shows when you have a high level of fuel dilution, when you have more moisture in your oil, it increases wear. That's not theoretical. That's real world proof.
Yeah.
That's why there are hybrid oils versus regular oils. It's because they know you're going to get more water in there. So you better do something about it.
Yeah.
But then what about a cold? Some of the people are saying, well, you've got a cold piston and that cold ignition, everything like that, affects the cylinder wall, the piston and things. What can you attest to that?
You need to get heat in it.
Yeah.
That way your clearances grow. Or they grow, but basically when you have a cold piston, you have more rock, right? So you have less seal.
Right.
As a piston ring guy and a cylinder seal guy, I can tell you, when that piston's cold, it's smaller. And the ring end gaps are wider. So basically you have the door wide open to put all of the junk,
the combustion
junk and water into the oil. Yeah. And by running the engine and getting it temperature in it faster, you're closing the door. The real interesting fact here is that the fuel dilution is less, like 40% less, but you put more fuel through the engine.
Yeah. So slow down, because we talked about this and me, I'm thinking, how come I didn't think of that? I mean, but speed's right. Listen, if we're idling at 1200, we've got so many combustion cycles at 1200 RPM. And every one of them's getting a shot of fuel on the power stroke. And so if we're out driving it and we're at 1500, 2000, think how much more, like you just said, how much more fuel we're actually putting in the engine to get out there and drive it. However, because we put more heat into it quicker, we're actually closing that door on the fuel getting down into the oil pan. And, I guess some people might say, there might be some people out there that might say, well, that you haven't proved to me that fuel in the oil is a detrimental thing.
You can't help some people. I'm sorry. If I'm talking to you, I'm talking to you. Some people can't be helped. But the science says
it's like
if there's less fuel in the oil when you get the engine warm. The faster you warm it up, the better you do.
So I think one of the things that I lacked in a 90-second video on a short that I did, because you got 90 seconds to explain to every scenario, everything from the North Pole down to,
you can't.
You can't.
Yeah, it's not a one size. I say it's not a one size fits all. I guess that would be the question we may pose to you here.
Well, and so I want to interject at this point. I wish that I would have said, okay, if it gets to a certain point, there's some things you can do. One of them, a lot of people complained, and I thought about that. Remember I have my 4 O's. Opposition is an opportunity with options to overcome. So the opposition is my car is freezing cold and I don't want to go out. My wife don't want to go out there and get in it. So I thought, okay, plug in a little ceramic space heater you get off of Amazon for $25 and then plug it in 10, 15 minutes before she goes out to get in the car. And the cab is warmed up and the windshield to be defroosted.
That has a safety switch that if it's not
if
on
it
a certain
tips
surface,
over,
it goes off.
It goes off. So I thought I can tell people about that, and that'll take care of the cab that's frosty cold, and you're not wasting fuel, diluting your engine oil, and causing wear.
There's a thing called seat heaters. Most new cars have them.
Well, my wife uses hers in the summer.
My wife, I know. Your mother loves a seat heater too, but I tell you, she doesn't only want her bum to be warm; she wants the air to be warm, and so you got to, you have to do that. But then the other thing is there are some add-ons that you can do on engines. Some of them don't work very well, and some of them I think work real well, like oil pan heaters, pads that adhesive,
like
pads.
A silicone pad.
Yeah,
this may be a few different questions.
Okay.
Well, I'll say it's pretty common in places, say like Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. The places it gets really, really cold is they do have block heaters.
Yeah.
So that they plug in their vehicles overnight. So if they don't have a garage to keep it in, they can just plug it in. So yeah, when you have a block heater that's keeping the water warm, then the rest of the engine's going to warm up faster.
Right.
So that the oil will get warm. Everything's will be much better that way. So I think the reality is when you get into the extreme cold areas, they already have their ways of dealing with it because you can only do so much mechanically within the engine. And the block heaters are a big part of that. That to me, that's the best way of looking at it.
Yeah, and I want to stay here right now. The point is, get as much heat. What's the quickest way we can get heat into the engine to cause the least amount of wear? And in those really cold, frigid places, there are things, transpan heaters, oil pan heaters to heat up the oil. The block heater to heat up the coolant. Although remember, guys, the block heater is not going to heat up your oil. It's going to heat up the antifreeze a little bit in it. The other thing, idling your truck there for a long, lengthy time, 30 minutes, has done nothing to heat up the differential.
Nope.
Has not done nothing to heat up the gear, the transfer case or any of that. So you might cause damage because you've idled it long. You get in there and you say, hey, my engine's all warmed up. And you go just take it off. Rock and roll.
Send it.
And your 90 weight in your differential is like
molasses,
dude. And it's not, and you're causing problems because it hasn't had enough shear for, warming that oil up. So you kind of have this false, idea that, okay, everything's warmed up. It's not. That's why it's always, again, better to, get out there and drive it gently.
Yeah. And Lake, can you kind of elaborate on the science with that and what kind of difference should people do with different temperatures? What is your best practice to recommend to people out there?
Yeah. If it's 40 below, let's help those people. If it's 40 below, best case scenario, what would you recommend?
I mean, doing like what we talked about is you go out there and crank it up, maybe let it idle for maybe 1 minute, and then drive it.
So still, same thing applies.
Yeah, because what you're going to do is if you're living in that 40 below area, you're using a 0W oil. You're not doing that with the 15W40.
Yeah, and if you are, you haven't read your owner's manual and you're not paying.
Right.
Yeah, you're
right.
Right.
And so more than likely, if it's negative 40 outside, I'm going to have a block heater, or it's going to be garaged. So
or an oil pan heater.
Something.
Yeah.
You're not letting it sit outside.
Right.
With no external way of protecting it. And you're not using, a 1550 oil or something like that. I'm using a 0 grade oil that will flow at that point in temperature, or when I say it flow, it will allow the engine to crank, and it's a positive displacement pump. It's going to put oil through the engine. So it will be lubricated. So if I'm using the right oil and I'm following those procedures, I'm going to be fine. Now, the real key here is back to say how you drive it. Because with an iron block, diesel engines, they're iron blocks. The clearances aren't really growing. The piston's going to grow a little bit, but the iron block's not growing. With, say, a turbo DI engine on gasoline, it's an aluminum block engine more than likely. That aluminum block can grow. But the thing you have to remember is the piston's also going to grow. So those engines typically have tighter clearances to begin with. So at that point, you just need to be a little more cautious about, this is not a qualifying lap.
Right.
You're cranking it up. I'm scraping my windshield off.
Right.
Now I'm getting in. I'm going to drive very gently until the needle comes off the gauge.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to go out there and I'm not going to red light race. I'm not going to try to jump out in traffic. I mean, really, where most of the low-speed pre-ignition problems come from is actually cold. Right. Not when the oil is warmed up. It's when the oil is cold, because it can hold more fuel, because you're also having wider ring gaps and all that. So the smartest thing you can do is to drive the car gently to warm it up before you begin to drive it like you normally drive it.
Yeah.
And the colder it is outside, the longer it's going to take for it to reach temperature. You just have to be cognizant of it.
We've been talking a lot about what's down in the pan, and we're getting into the fuel right now. And I think it should be stated, we should state that fuel, when it's cold, does not atomize, whether it's diesel or gasoline. It just, the injector sprays it onto the side of that cold cylinder wall, and it basically is like a droplets that's just hanging on the cylinder wall. And that's where this low speed pre-ignition stuff is happening. And it's also why the diesel fuel is 40% more diluted when we're just idling it. The oil is more diluted. It's because the fuel was so cold and it's hitting that cold cylinder wall, and it's basically just washing down the wall.
Right. Well, and that door, like Lake said earlier, is wide open for that contamination to just go right by.
And there's, again, we've been talking just about engine damage. How about we get into the really expensive stuff? DPF, CATs, all that other stuff that you're sitting there, and what causes soot? What's the number one cause of soot? Low combustion temperatures.
Right.
There you go. So there's another point that I want to make. Low combustion temperatures are happening when you're just sitting idling.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're putting, our test here is just for the oil, but now we could go back and do some testing on flow, how much soot buildup is happening under, just idling the truck or the car, compared to if you get out and, drive it kindly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, soot's the biggest enemy with diesels. People don't realize it. Soot is the number one source of wear in a diesel engine.
And that's why we have different oils for diesel compared to gas, is because we're trying to contain that soot that's coming down into the crankcase by the combustion chamber.
Yeah. Historically, a gasoline engine oil would have a different type of what I call dispersant chemistry that keeps the soot in suspension. It would be a different type and a different amount. So just in terms of treat rate, so if you look at a bottle of motor oil, say a quarter motor oil is going to be usually about 90% base oil and viscosity index improver, 10% additive. That's on a gasoline engine oil. A diesel engine oil could be 80% base oil and viscosity index improvers and 20% additive. Most of that 10% change is dispersant chemistry to handle soot. Like literally when Cat and Mack and Cummins, when they do diesel engine tests, they take carbon black, which is a soot surrogate, and they dose the oil, the brand new oil, before it ever goes in the engine. They load it up with carbon to be able to go run their 100-hour test. Because if they don't do that, they won't get an answer in the first 100 hours. They'll have to run further and further and further. So just to give people an idea of how expensive and intensive diesel engine testing is, an API licensed diesel engine oil has to pass 8 different engine tests. Some of those engine tests, like just one of them, might be a 500-hour test.
Wow.
Now, think about that engine running on a dyno for 500 hours straight. It will consume more than a full tanker load of diesel to run that one test. That's over 3,000 gallons. And this isn't regular diesel. This is test standard diesel that's about $10 a gallon. So just to pay for all the engine tests to test one diesel oil is over $1 million.
You know, we were just at Cummins, like at the PRI show, and we toured the factory. Holy smoke.
Isn't that place amazing?
Amazing. Yeah, it was like a candy shop for us.
Their 95 liter, we went to the plant,
the Seymour
plant, where they build their 95 liter, and they showed us, you know, their dyno rooms. I mean, their dyno room's bigger than this whole room.
Right.
And they bring in the engines in on train tracks. And, you know, it's amazing the technology that they're using to make sure that these $1 million engines are, you know, on site and they're going to last.
So what about a question that we've kind of talked about is, what about the people that use a diesel oil in their gas engine? Is that better? I mean, what's the...
Yeah, there's a cult out there that likes to do that. You know,
they put Rotella in everything.
Yeah. And I think they do it,
including their yard tractor.
I know.
I think they do it because they're like, oh, I can capture some of that soot.
No. What they're thinking is there's 2 primarily reasons someone chooses the diesel oil, right? Or why they think a diesel oil is always better. One, they think that there's more zinc in it, which that's actually true, right? There's been enough people that have, you know, gone on Bob is the Oil Guy or, you know, wherever else, and they've seen all the different posts, you know, with the virgin oil analysis of different oils, and like, oh, what, you know, I know that, you know, gasoline engine oils, you know, that they've had a reduction in the amount of zinc in the oil, so I don't want that now, right? There was a time that was a legitimate thing, right? I mean, again, I'll plead guilty. I was probably one of the first people to ever wave that flag and say, hey, everybody, pay attention. The amount of zinc in your passenger car oils is changing. You guys have flat Tappet cams. It's hurting your engine. You need to go away from that.
Right.
There was a time when that was true. That's not true now, though. So during that time period, people went to diesel oil because the diesel oils had a higher level of ZDP, and you could still go buy it at O'Reilly's or AutoZone or Walmart or wherever you bought oil. So it was the easy thing to do at the time. And at the time, it actually was better. That was 20 years ago. That's not now.
Yeah. Right.
Things have changed.
Right.
So that was the number one reason people did it. Well, then also too, diesel oils, because of diesels being high compression and very low speed, they're really hard on bearings. So the oils have to be shear stable. They can't lose that viscosity. So gasoline engines, the oil shearing mechanically some actually gives them fuel economy. Diesels historically haven't cared about fuel economy. So a gasoline engine oil typically is less shear stable than a diesel oil. So people who may have been doing oil analysis noted, hey, if I use this diesel oil, my viscosity stays in grade. And, the engine everything looks good. Okay, great. Then that's where that kind of cult of just put Rotella or diesel oil, in everything in your good kind of came from. All right, so that's the positives, right? Those two things are true. The downside is this, that while the oil may have more zinc in it, it also has more dispersant, and the dispersant competes against the zinc. So you may actually not be getting as good a protection for your flat tappet cam as the off-the-shelf passenger car oil today.
Well, let me ask you though, if we don't, let's get away from flat tappet cams. Let's say we got a roller cam or an overhead that's got
direct
roller
injections,
rockers.
something more modern.
Yeah. Would that still, should we still?
Yeah, because flat tappets are just harder. So if anything that will work in a flat tappet works downstream. Flat tappets are just mechanically harder to lubricate than a roller cam engine is.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it does track that direction. And the real thing is this. So while the diesel oils historically have had more zinc, they've also had more detergent dispersant chemistry. And then that's really the other part of it is the detergent. Because in the old days, we had, high sulfur diesel and we had, standard sulfur diesel.
Right.
That sulfur in the diesel could react with that water from combustion and create sulfuric acid. So you needed to have an acid neutralizer, called a base, in the oil. So traditionally, diesel oils had a higher base number, had more acid neutralizing acids in there. Oh, it's chemistry. Now we're getting we're getting into chemistry now. That's where I get excited.
It's still inorganic chemistry. I hope we don't go to organic or I'm going to lose my mind.
We'll be all right. We'll be all right. So essentially, you had to have these additives to help neutralize the acids so the engine didn't corrode from the inside out. Because that's actually what happens with most engines. They don't mechanically wear out. They typically corrode out. Historically, that's been the case, right? Especially when leaded fuels, high sulfur fuels back in the day, it was all about corrosion protection. That's how you made engines live longer. Now, that's not the case today because a lot of things have changed. But back to one of the fallacies or the shortcomings of a diesel oil and a gasoline engine is that the high level of detergent additives, calcium, sodium, things like that used to be at a really high level in diesel oils actually causes this.
Low speed pre-ignition.
All right, yeah. This is detonation that occurred in the top ring groove because the calcium detergent that neutralizes those acids can also cling and hold the fuel. And the mixture of the fuel and the calcium, and oil has a lower octane than gasoline, it will auto-ignite in the ring groove.
And you're saying that happens because of, well, I guess, tell us why that happens.
Yeah.
Okay. So this detonation event occurred because there was a mixture of the oil, which contains the calcium, and the fuel. And that mixture of oil and fuel has a lower octane than the fuel does, so it auto-ignited.
So the ignition, instead of happening here,
happened here, which blew it down.
You got pre-ignition in your ringland.
Yes.
Wow.
That's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And that could have been prevented with proper oil.
Right. So
now let's
back up just real quick before we lose the track. So we said we know way back in the day, lead in the fuel, sulfur in the fuels, we had corrosion. So what did the industry do? We started increasing the detergent level. We went from a low level of calcium, went from non-detergent oils way back in the day. So now we're adding in detergents, calcium, sodium, magnesium, and those numbers are getting higher and higher and higher over time. So when we got to API SN, which was the previous oil spec, that was the highest level we had seen. So when we went from, and of course the ZDP levels were going down in the early 2000s. So we went from not having a limit on ZDP to 1,200 parts per million, down to 1,000, down to 800. Well, when we hit 800, that's when all the camshaft problems came up and everything got to be a big issue. Hang on. But what we didn't know was, or people didn't realize that as the ZDP levels were going down, the calcium detergent levels were going up. And that tipping point where everything hit the fan and there was, flat tappet cam problems and race guys, even with roller cams, are having problems. That was when we had the ZDP levels at the lowest and the calcium levels at the highest. You had the most unbalance.
Right.
Back to Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Right. We had everything whacked out.
Too
wrong.
hot, too cold.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's just not working. But then this came around.
Direct injection.
Right. And the direct injection exposed the limitation of too much detergent, especially the calcium and the sodium. So it's happened since the advent of this showing up with direct injection is the calcium levels and the sodium levels are going down. Like sodium used to be in a lot of different brands of oil. It's gone now. Like you hardly ever see sodium. Like if I'm doing used oil analysis and I see sodium, it's because of the head gasket leak, because it's from the coolant additive. It's not from being in the engine oil. Very few oils have sodium. And the calcium levels went from 2,800 parts per million to 3,000 parts per million. Now, even in a diesel oil, it might be only 1,400 parts per million a lot of times now. And in a passenger car oil, it may be 500 or 600 or 700 parts per million. So the calcium levels have come way down, but the ZDP levels stayed the same. So what's happened? The wear protection of the oils have gotten better because you changed that balance, which goes back to the whole thing we did at Joe Gibbs Racing. Why was the braking oil high zinc, low detergent? It was balance. We solved the camshaft problem 20-something years ago by affecting the balance. That same thing is playing out today because of preventing this.
Yeah,
so oils today are better now because of that.
And let's just throw out here, so a lot of people, we don't put zinc in oil anymore because it wipes out catalytic converters. So that's,
that's the reason they
the industry,
limited it.
Yeah, a lot of people out there are like, well, let's just start putting. You don't go buy a bottle of zinc and pour it into your oil every time you change your oil, or you're going to be replacing cats a lot quicker than you want to be replacing.
Yeah.
So,
and it may not do what you think it's going to do anyway.
Exactly. That's what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like we've just looked behind the curtain of all these secrets, because everybody, unless you own an electric vehicle, has got to change their oil.
Right.
So it's almost like what you're putting into your body. It's like, just because you can buy it on the shelf
doesn't mean it's good.
Doesn't mean it's good for you. I mean, just because you can roll into some place and have your oil changed, are they putting in the right oil? Are they putting in the correct weight? We hear a lot of customers say, oh, well, I want to use a 1540 just because that's what my dad used, or that's what my grandpa used. So I'm going to use that because it's worked for me. That you can't have that be your logic anymore, because things have changed. So, I mean, use the viscosity of oil that they recommend in the owner's manual for the right temperatures, but you can't just use what your grandpa used to use just because anymore.
Well, that's why you look at GM with the DEXOS specification. That's one of the main reasons why GM came out with DEXOS for the gasoline engines, is because they were going the direct injection route.
Yeah.
The LT platform and all this, and they're like, we need this. Well, at the same time they're doing that, well, Chrysler wasn't doing direct injection. So they didn't have this problem. So the Chrysler guys didn't care about that.
Right.
So, but they're trying to say, well, they're like, okay, wait, as API, as this collective between the oil industry and the auto industry, we're trying to create a specification that works for everybody. If you were totally DI route, you were suffering.
Right.
And the people that weren't DI were like, well, we don't care.
Right.
And they're like, well, we're going to do our own thing to make sure we're good.
Right.
So that they led the way that direction. Now, the good thing is this spring, API SQ, the next spec comes out. So with API SP, they redid all of the engine tests and made it where the engines we were actually testing oil with represented what's actually on the street today.
Right.
Because they had been legacy engines that had been around for a long, I mean, it was a 3.8 liter Buick V6 from the 80s was still being run as one of the test engines up until 4 years ago. That's the honest truth, right?
Wow.
And so there were some ancient, there's still some ancient engines in there, but the reality is with API SP, they have modern turbocharged direct injection engines, double overhead cam type engines and stuff that's more modern.
Representative. Yeah.
So that's what it is. So now with SQ coming out, all the engines are still the same as API SP, but they've tightened some specs, right? They said, okay, here, we see some areas of improvement in the real world. If we maybe tighten this spec over here, there can be a benefit to the consuming public by doing that. And that's what SQ is coming out with this spring.
Yeah.
So how long have you been doing this, Lake?
Well, I started working at Gibbs September 27th, 2004. And that was the first day we went and visited Lubrizol. And before then, I had no idea who Lubrizol was.
Right.
I knew nothing about any of this stuff.
Right.
And I showed up there at their place and we went to the basement because they had this little bitty tiny conference room in the basement, no windows, no nothing.
That's the Skunk Works, isn't it? That's the company Skunk Works.
Well, I was telling Miles, the story was, so Lubrizol had been doing oil formulations for all the race teams, NASCAR, IndyCar, Formula One, because all the big brands you see on the cars, they're just marketers.
Yeah.
They don't do any of the chemistry. They don't do any of the testing.
Sure.
It's the oil companies or the additive companies that do all the work.
Yeah. They're just putting a label on it and
right.
calling it theirs. Yeah.
So the Lubrizol guys had all this knowledge and they're like, we're going to pick one of these teams and we're going to work with one of these teams and we're going to bring out and try to sell to the public, the racers around the world, what we've been making for these teams privately. And so the guy that was in charge of that program had gone to the CEO of Lubrizol and basically had to ask for permission. And the CEO of Lubrizol said, I'll give you just enough rope to hang yourself. So this was such a low project that all they would give us was a basement conference room to deal with this thing. And we went up there and we started talking and man, I knew nothing. And they're bringing me in on this program to try to learn stuff. And every time they said something, I had a question. Because, they were like blowing up myths left and right. And I'm like, well, how can you do this? I don't understand. They're just blowing up my world. And I'm like, I remember calling my wife and I got home that night or back to the hotel. And I was like, I've never seen anything like this.
You're like, I don't know anything. Honey, I'm just I don't know anything.
Like they've literally blown up my entire worldview. Yeah. Like nothing, like the world's upside down compared to what I thought it was. You know, all my experiences, like, wow, this is amazing. And so based on that, I just kept on asking questions. I wanted to learn more.
Yeah.
And I was really fortunate that they at that time, they had a lot of people retiring. And so their they were really worried about losing all that tribal knowledge. So they had developed a program of mentorship and internal training. So the guy that was in charge of our program was in that. And he let me join their program. So I was being trained by veteran Lubrizol people and taking classes from Lubrizol, even though I wasn't a Lubrizol employee.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I was totally amazing.
Yeah. Cool.
So the long story short was, come back, 5 years later, we're not meeting in the basement now. We're meeting in the penthouse now. Because now this is like the flagship pride program for the whole company.
Wow.
Because they're winning races, they're winning championships, and it's a big deal.
Well, is it? I mean, in a way, that's a life, and to see your expression and your excitement about it, that changed your life. Because all of a sudden, and how often does that change anyone's life when all of a sudden you have all these beliefs, you've been living that way, whether it's Christianity, whether it's a philosophy or a learning experience.
Yeah.
And it pierces you, and that changes your whole life, and that's an awesome thing. And to see your face, and you still have the excitement of a young kid that like it blew my whole world up. But then I understood the world wasn't flat.
Oh, light bulbs were going off. Literally, I was that kid that had my Honda Civic, and my dad saw the race shop, And I remember we used Torco MPZ 2050 in the race engines. And I'm like, well, if that's good enough for my race engine, I'm going to put that in my Honda. And I put it in my Honda, and it killed all the O2 sensors in it. Because Hondas use oil.
Yeah.
Right? And one reason why they use a lot of oil is because I had a 2050 in an engine made for a 530.
Right.
Yeah.
So the oil ring tension was just too low for what I was doing.
Yeah.
But I know that now. At the time, I had no idea. I'm like, well, this stuff's garbage. It ruined my engine.
Right.
Well, no, dummy. It was all my fault.
It wasn't
the
right
oil's
oil.
fault. Right. Yeah, I got it wrong. So
Yeah.
I have pretty much committed most of the sins that I make videos trying to help people avoid.
Well, I think that's our whole reason for starting our social media as well, is because
absolutely I would have never been dragged into this if there wasn't a real upside. And the upside for me was more education.
Yeah.
Well, and the excitement to see that you had back in 2004 by just, having your world blown up, so to say, is what you believed versus what was actual truth is what we want to help give. And so that's why it's a treat to have you and people in the future like Mark and all of these industry leaders come to help educate us and educate this whole audience, is because it's like, this is, gosh, you're changing your oil every few months, every few thousand miles. Like, it's important to be educated on what you're putting in and the value that it has and everything else. And which, we wanted to talk about fuel as well, which we'll get to with, most of what we do is diesel, but I think this information, or I know this information, is so helpful to so many people because their butt's probably in a seat right now using oil, and they need to know, and it's using, they're using some sort of fuel, and they need to know what they should be doing to
prevent damage,
to keep their investment going.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so now I want to talk about something that I was very proud of. I'm still very proud of it. And I've never gone out and said, in fact, I was a guy a long time, I would call things snake oil.
Right.
And I am a believer that there's a lot of guys selling snake oil still out of the back of a wagon that's going to fix, what ails you. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of it out of there. And I kind of like to classify snake oil in a certain way. I don't know a chemical that will fix anything. That's where I say, I start in my mind. Now, I want to be educated if I'm wrong, but I don't know of a chemical that fixes anything. But I think there's chemicals that prevent things. Mm-hmm. And
reduces wear.
Prevention.
Yeah.
Prevent it and maintenance. And that's why, I want to get into, we call it Dave's secret sauce. I'm going to say that publicly. I was not the guy that decided that was the name to be on there, but that was my son's idea, so we're going to go with that. But I looked around and I thought, because of the low sulfur fuels, I have an opportunity here more than a lot of people. S&S Diesel, Fleece, all these companies that we're friends with and that we promote, because of the size of my operation here and how many vehicles I'm getting from all over America to do engines in, and they're getting shipped here, we see a lot of the same problems. I mean, it's a real unique opportunity. I wish people understood that. A lot of times people think like, I'm just dogging on, this particular product. No, I just see a lot more than the normal guy that's got a 3 or 4 bay shop. There's 30 bays of repair here and a full engine machine shop. And we've been doing this a long time.
Well, that's your experience is just like mine with oil analysis.
Right. It's deep.
When I see 30 or 40 or 50 oil samples every day from every kind of environment, I just will see more in a week than most people will in their lifetime. You see more vehicles and more problems in a week than most people will see in their lifetime.
Well, we do. I mean, how many thousand a year do we see of engines and of vehicles that drive in here? Same thing with you in oil analysis. If you're seeing 30 to 40 a day, it's like
add it up. It gets to be a lot. And when you add decades and decades onto it, it's just
you can see the trends, and you're like, hey, this is a pretty obvious trend.
So this is why, of all the things that I could have put my name on, I chose one. I chose one because as I looked at these pumps that keep,
because we're seeing one of the reasons that spawned this is experience, but the CP4 pump where we're seeing, I mean, failures that are costing people and putting them in a position that they have no choice.
Tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking
10 to 15 grand.
Yeah, every time.
If you want your truck running, like no matter if it's us or the dealership or whoever else, you got to pay $10,000 to $15,000, and that's crappy.
And I'm going to just add to that. That's if you're. I know I want to say this. That's if you're lucky. Okay. That's if you're lucky. That's if the pump or the injector that went down didn't blowtorch a hole through your piston. Okay. That, you know, I know people like, how could he be calling a guy lucky because he's got to spend 10 to 15 grand to replace his whole fuel system? Because if you got unlucky, it burned a hole in the piston, because that's the number one cause of, you know, a hole in a diesel piston is you had a fuel system issue that just got out of control and went haywire, and your exhaust temperature, your combustion temperatures went through the roof. So I really thought hard about it. It's like, okay, and I've even got a T-shirt that says "Do your maintenance, dang it." You know, I'm busy. I am an engine builder that's trying to tell you, do this so that you don't have to come and see me.
Right.
I mean, honestly, and a lot of people saying Dave's just trying to make money. No, I'm not. I am in business, so yes, I'm trying to make money.
But you're plenty busy already.
I'm plenty busy already.
Yeah, if we could help majority of our customers by just educating them and giving them value that way, then it's a win-win for us.
Well, I like that.
Yeah.
We got plenty of work.
Yeah.
I mean,
with the tens of millions of cars out there.
Knock on wood. Got a wood table here. Knock on wood. We got with our national president, we got plenty of work, and we're here. And we'll always be doing good engines and building engines. But I really looked at this, and because of, and I'm gonna make a statement, but I really want to ask you a question. Why does it seem, and this is on my social media, so I'm going to tell you what's going on. We have a lot of people in Europe that don't seem to have the problem with their CP4s that are on the Volkswagens and the BMW diesel cars, and I don't know about trucks, you know, but on their diesel cars, it's the same pump, CP4 pump. They're not having the experiences that we're having here in America. Is that related to the quality of our fuel here compared to Europe? And is there anything, I mean, is this, and Speed, I know you're not going to, you'd never lie. You wouldn't tell me. Is this the best thing we can do, or is there something better we can do to protect our fuel systems?
The fuel in Europe is different.
Tell us.
So depending upon where you are in Europe, you may not be on ultra low sulfur diesel. Or you might be on ultra low sulfur diesel like you have here, but literally if you go in the UK, which has ultra low sulfur diesel, there's regular diesel and there's premium diesel. You don't find that anywhere here in the US.
Almost like gasoline here at the US, how you have different octanes.
Yeah, but in this case, it's not, the cetane isn't different. It's the additives. What's in that bottle, or the idea of what's in that bottle,
right,
is already in the fuel.
So you have a choice between just regular ultra low sulfur diesel or something
that has more detergent and lubricity additives in it. And they have that there. They don't have that here.
That's why
Why don't they have that in the US?
Historically, the fleet of vehicles, the car park, they call it, in Europe is predominantly diesel. In the US, is predominantly gasoline based. For a long time, there actually was a trade. I'm not sure it still happened that way today, but there used to be a trade between the refineries in Europe and in the US, because in Europe they made more gasoline than they could use. In the US, we made more diesel than we could use, so we just swapped. There would be tankers going back and forth across the ocean, bringing us their excess gasoline. We would send them their excess diesel. And that's how it worked. But things are changing, right? And so with ultra low sulfur diesel, to get better engine protection, because again, back to the corrosion, right? The higher level of sulfur, the more corrosive the fuel becomes. So now we have ultra low sulfur diesel, so that's better for the environment, that's better for the engine life in terms of wear. But the problem is now you have like the injectors. They need that lubricity. So the older Pintle style injectors they needed that lubricity. I mean, let's call it like it is. The reason why Forrest Lucas is a billionaire is because he was one of the first guys to put a lubricity additive in a bottle and hand it to a diesel guy, and they were able to realize, oh my gosh, this is great. Not that he was a great chemist, that he was actually the first one on the scene to show up and recognize the change in fuel caused a need, and putting a fuel additive in the diesel fixed it.
And this is an ignorant comment on my end. I don't know who this Forrest
Lucas.
Lucas Oil. Oh, okay.
That's okay.
Yeah, Forrest Lucas.
I'm so proud of you. You know, that people, how many times does anybody sit in an audience and go, I don't know what he's talking about? And they just let it go.
Yeah.
So,
well, no,
knuckles for that, bro.
I know who Lucas Oil is, but I didn't know that.
Forrest Lucas was a truck driver.
Really?
Yeah.
And he just saw there's a need.
Well, I've heard a crazy story. I'm not sure if it's true or not. So
and his first name was Forrest? I did not know
Forrest,
that.
yeah. Forrest Lucas. And the story I've heard was that, he was hauling, truck driver, and he was hauling some goods, and one of his customers didn't have enough money to pay him for the load he'd hauled. But the guy said, hey, I've got these couple of barrels of additive here that you can put in your fuel. And he's like, well, I'll take something rather than nothing. So he got these barrels, and there was a label on there, and he called him up, and again, urban legend here, it was from Lubrizol. So he called up Lubrizol and said, hey, what the heck is this stuff? And they said, oh, that's a blah, blah, blah. It's the diesel fuel additive. He's like, okay, well, how much am I supposed to use? And they said, hey, use it this much per gallon. Well, he started putting it in his truck, and he's like, man, I think this is making a difference. So he gave some to his other buddies who are other truck drivers, and they're like, this stuff makes a difference. And that's the urban myth of how it got started. But yeah, they showed up.
How far back is that?
This is in the 90s.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's not that long ago.
No, you were born in 1990. Dude.
Yeah,
that ain't that long ago.
I'm still young.
Yeah,
But the iteration is this. So that's where they started with going to ultra low sulfur diesel and the older Pintle style injectors that needed lubricity. Now what we have is high pressure common rail, CP4 pump.
Right.
Now you have a real challenge in the fact that not only do you still need lubricity, you still need detergency because you need to keep the injectors clean. Because when you get any kind of deposit buildup in that injector, because how the modern piezoelectric, the tolerances are so tight, if you get any kind...
Yeah, we're talking microns here.
I think it's I've
looked at it under a microscope with
SNS.
SNS Luke. Yeah. The size openings on a modern diesel injector is 10 times smaller than a human hair. That's how small the opening is.
Yeah.
Because it's trying to... That injector
atomize that.
Well, yeah, that injector's firing during a compression cycle. It depends on the tune of the truck, but it can be firing, from 3 to 10 times during a compression cycle. Mm-hmm. And what you want is a fog. You do not want droplets coming in there, and that's how they do it. And here's another thing: we're now these old style Huey systems. You're talking maybe at max 5,000 psi. On those fuel systems, where now
they crank and start. I think they require like 500 psi to even.
Yeah, that's it. Which is nothing. That ain't nothing.
Yeah, and then it ramps right up. Yeah,
but a CP4 pump, you can ramp that thing up to 25,000 psi real quick.
Yeah,
and what happens, when you're taking anything under pressure, fuel, and you're taking it and you're ramping it up to that much pressure, you're generating a lot of heat. A lot of heat. When you take a fluid at 0 degrees and all of a sudden you're just putting it under 2,500 psi, you're making a tremendous amount of heat in that fuel.
And roughly every 20 degrees Fahrenheit that you increase the temperature of a oil, or in this case, because think about it, fuel and oil are both hydrocarbons. So they're just the same thing in a lot of ways. Every 20 degrees Fahrenheit, you increase the temperature, you double the rate of oxidation. Oxidation is the chemical breakdown. So the fuel wants to break down and create deposits, and it gets thinner. So everything is working against the lubricity.
Right.
So that's the whole thing. With the modern fuel systems, you need improved detergency to keep things clean. you need improved lubricity, and you need oxidation stability. Those are the three things that you need. And that's why a off-the-shelf fuel additive for diesel is beneficial, because the pump diesel has a minimum level of standard. Essentially, the same fuel spec we had today is what we had 30 years ago. It hasn't really changed that much. But engine hardware has changed a lot.
A lot.
Yeah. Right. So does it, if I go to the gas station and put diesel in my truck, does it have any lubricity besides the sulfur or any detergents in it that are beneficial at all?
So a biodiesel blend. So a lot of states will have anywhere from a 5 to 10% biodiesel. And so pretty much anywhere you go in the US, there's a lot of places that have some level of biodiesel. Well, the biodiesel constituent actually is a lubricity additive.
Okay.
That actually is part of it. But in terms of detergency, no, unless it's top tier. So that's the reason why there's a top tier fuel spec. So regular fuel just meets the EPA minimums. But the top tier goes beyond that. And there's both top tier for gasoline and for diesel. So the newest top tier diesel spec has increased detergency and increased cleanliness, because that's the thing that no one's talking about when it comes to these CP4 pump failures. It's the cleanliness of the fuel matters a lot. You have to keep the fuel clean. So changing the fuel filters, using the right kind of fuel filters, not using some kind of wire screen thing that you can wash. Don't do that.
Okay,
it sounds convenient. Don't do that.
This filtration. So, there are aftermarket filtration systems. And a lot of people say, well, why don't you put a filter on the pump after coming out of the pump? Well, because you got 25,000 PSI.
No.
You're not going to filter 25,000 PSI. It's going to blow right through an element. So I hope that answers that question, because somebody would have already designed it, and that would be me. But I want to go back to we're into fuel, and I want to talk about fuel filters and better filtration. But I want to also get into, we just did a motor with almost 1 million miles on it.
I saw that.
Yeah, 6.7. And he has a secondary bypass oil filtration system. And it's filtering down to 2 microns. Now, this isn't the main. So I
1
keep
micron.
saying, yeah, is it 1 micron? Okay. It's taking a very small amount of the engine oil. It's not taking all the engine oil coming out of the fuel pump. So it's taking
oil pump.
I meant to say oil. I keep saying fuel because we went to fuel, but I'm back to oil. So how do you feel about those? Because I'm fascinated. I think it's a great idea. You're taking a little bit of that oil and you're constantly saying, okay, we're gonna draw out those dirt particles, the soot that's in that oil, and captured in this. What's your feeling on those?
Bypass filtration is what you're talking about.
Yes,
is very common in industrial applications, especially where they have very large common sumps. Hydraulic situations, it's pretty common where you need to have a high level of cleanliness, so you can't pass all the oil through that tight of a filter. So you have this bypass system. So again, it's very common, and within a diesel engine, it is very effective for managing soot.
Yeah.
The soot is the enemy, and you can typically see a reduction in soot when you have a bypass system attached to it. So there's definitely beneficial. I don't think you really see a need for it on gasoline as much, but you do see a benefit from diesel getting the soot out of there. I'm not saying you couldn't put one in a gasoline engine. It's probably overkill. But again, I'd be willing to do the science and let the science tell us the answer, not my opinion.
Yeah.
So you're saying with the filtration that doing a bypass oil filter is excellent, mostly on diesel.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the fuel side, now, are you talking about the filtration that comes and goes into a gas station, or are you talking about the filtration that's happening on a vehicle?
So it's all of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the reality is the cleanliness of the fuel you get at the pump varies.
Sure.
Which is crazy to me. I would think that there would be some universal or at least a nationwide standard that's like it has to meet this.
Well, there is. But the problem is if you kind of look, do some research, what you're going to find is that the published cleanliness standard for diesel, because there is one, is dirtier than what is suggested by most of the fuel pump and fuel injector manufacturers.
So it's not meeting the baseline that
a CP4 pump or certain pumps
needs to have
require
to survive.
Wow.
Oh. Yeah. So the two industries,
we're peeking behind the curtain again.
Yeah,
That's
well, the
crazy.
two industries haven't sat down at a table and said, okay, this is what we need, meaning Bosch, the manufacturer. This is what we need, and then the fuel guys are going, got it, we'll do that. That's not happening.
From my understanding, Bosch went. A lot of manufacturers came to Bosch and said, "Hey, I need something that's going to be a little bit more universal, so I can use it on a Ford or a BMW or a Land Rover or something like this." And Bosch, to their credit, was like, "Okay, here's a pretty universal pump. Here you go. This is going to solve all your problems." But what you're saying is that, they're the third party that plays a role as far as like people doing the fuel are like, "Here's what you get."
Yeah.
And so all three, the manufacturer of the vehicle, the pump.
So perfect
fuel.
example. Take the same exact truck. Let's say it's an F-350 with a 6.7 power stroke in it. All right.
Okay.
Let's put that thing down in North Florida. And it's someone's daily driver. Let's say they 30, 40 miles, down the highway to work. And they're stopping at the QT. And they just because it's QT is cheap, but guess what? QT is also top tier. And so without even knowing it, they're using top tier fuel and they're just running around.
Interesting.
Take that same truck, saw the same parallels. We're not changing altitude or elevation here. Go put it out in Texas on a farm. And now I've got my bulk diesel tank that I get filled up from the local oil jobber, comes up and he fuels my tank on the farm. And I'm over there grabbing my farm diesel, putting it in my truck half the time. Maybe if I'm going to town or whatever, I might get some gas in town, but usually I'm going to be getting it out of my bulk tank here on my farm. Almost guaranteed the fuel is way dirtier on the farm than it is back there.
Yeah.
And this guy's pump is going to fail way before the guy in Florida's will.
Yeah, right. Lake, that I fish around the world a lot. I'm a big marlin fisherman. And I'll tell you what, you get down in the bottom of these boats that got these big man, V16s in them and V12s, and they got fuel polishers down there that if you look at their filtration system on these boats, it's as much as a car. I mean, they look like they got to cost $50,000, and they call them fuel polishers. And it's because they know that when they're pumping fuel in Costa Rica or Panama or someplace in Mexico, they don't know what they're getting. And they're not going to let all that fuel go into their injection pump and be trying to fire up a motor that's going to cost them $1 million to get out of the hull of that thing. So they've been behind this for a long time, that their filtration is a major component on these boats because of what he's talking about. They're buying fuel from off a dock somewhere in the jungle.
Fun fact: do you know how many different fuel specs are in the U.S., just the U.S., for gasoline today?
I don't know. Fuel like gasoline or diesel?
No, for gasoline. How many different specs?
So when you say specs, like regular,
I'm saying just for say regular. We'll just say take regular 87 octane gasoline, and say there are how many different versions of 87 octane, not brands.
5.
14.
Oh wow.
So if I'm in Los Angeles and I buy 87 octane gasoline in Los Angeles, that fuel is chemically different than the fuel you could buy in Bakersfield, which is different than the fuel you would buy in Atlanta, Georgia, or the fuel that you would buy in Miami, Florida, or the fuel that you would buy in Chicago.
And it's 87 octane.
It can be 87 octane, all from the same brand.
Even the same brand.
Even the same brand.
So a Chevron here in Utah and a Chevron in
LA
yeah.
is different.
Huh.
That's EPA. So they have different regulations. So the LA South Coast Air Quality Management, they have a very specific gas formulation spec they have to meet that's just for the South Coast area. You go outside of that and it's different. You go up in Washington State, there's a different one. There's a map you can see, and it's got all the different places. Now, most of this the country, is the we'll call it the generic standard, but there's these 13 other boutique blends that exist. This is one of the issues that people will say, well, I've never had that problem before. Well, you might be living in one of those areas where your fuel is different than everybody else's.
Okay. Yeah.
Or you may be having this weird problem. No one else is having that problem, but it might be because you got this weird fuel.
That's exactly what I'm saying. People, we get the comments on our social media, and people in Europe are not experiencing the pump failures that we're having here. And this is why, getting back, this is
the
why,
fuel is different.
Yeah. And this is why
Someone said earlier something about the fuel being the enemy of your oil.
Well, some
smart guy.
Some smart guy said that.
Well, when you spend a lot of your life formulating engine oil and you work really, really hard to create the very best oil you can, and then people go out there and they break it, and you try to figure out why. Why does this oil work just fine over here? Not just fine, it works excellent here, but it's failing over here. What did I do wrong? Then you realize is that
you didn't do anything wrong. They formulated it differently.
Over here, I've got different fuel.
Yeah. Okay.
I've got different things happening in different parts of the world.
Yeah.
Like crazy things. In sub-Saharan Africa.
Oh, we're going deep, man. We're going over into the different part of the world.
It's common, even in a brand new car, for them to take the thermostat out.
That's a big.
Well,
it's
been common. See, you're young.
No,
you're young. A lot of guys.
I know that we've done it. Like in certain applications.
Well, it's a terrible idea. It's not a good idea.
Thank you for saying that.
It's a terrible, terrible idea.
The one time that I remember doing it years ago was, some
hang
guy
with us, because we're gonna land this plane in a second, and you're gonna be like, where did we get there?
And I remember being like, oh crap, that was a bad idea.
Well, here's the only reason, and I've been fixing cars for 50 years, so I've been doing this for a long time. Back in the day when I was working at a taxi cab and limousine company, those old checker cabs that had 305 Chevys in them and stuff like that, and then the limousines were 500 Cadillac, the Oldsmobile Eldorado, the big old 500 cubic inch Cadillac engines in them. And they would run hot during the summer. And the cab company was so cheap that they really wouldn't fix the problem with the overheating. They just say, take the thermostat out of there. And I don't know whether it ever worked. I just did what I was told. But I mean, so during the summer, and we never put them back in the winter that I remember, but we'd be removing thermostats. But back then, you could kind of get away with it because you didn't have emission. They were carbureted.
They didn't set a check engine light.
They didn't set a check engine light. They weren't worrying about, getting the cat fired up and hot, and getting the engine up to temperature quick.
So why did they do that part of the world?
Because it's hot. And
yeah.
So the whole idea was, why would we put something on our vehicle that would make the engine hot when we're in a hot environment?
Yeah.
But the answer we actually already discussed.
Yeah, there you go.
So what happened is they would get more sludge build up in the engine because sludge is generated at low engine temperatures. So because they didn't have the thermostat,
they were trying to keep it low.
They kept it low. They kept the engine colder, and it actually built more sludge.
That's why here in America, when somebody will buy a car, you don't see it too much anymore, but people would buy a car. My grandma, she only drove that back and forth to church and the grocery store once a week and stuff like that. You tear that engine down, it was full of just black, thick sludge. It's because the engine never got hot enough to burn off the acids.
Yeah, the 5 minutes to church didn't even get a top rating.
That will ruin an engine.
Yeah.
So back to idle or not to idle. I think we just answered the question.
Yeah. All right.
And then, so the question is not ours or, is diesel fuel additive a snake oil?
No.
Yeah.
And because
Well, I would say this. When you have a diesel specific product, right, where it's made for a diesel engine, that's what it's for.
Good.
It's not for a gasoline engine. It's not for something else. That's not snake oil. I would be cautious of any additive that claims you can put it in gas or diesel, because compression ignition, spark ignition are two different things.
Yeah.
You cannot chemically be good for both.
Yeah. One size does not fit all.
No, because if you're either improving cetane or you're hurting octane, or you're increasing octane and hurting cetane.
Yeah.
And the detergent chemistry for gasoline that's effective is different than the detergent chemistry that works best for diesel.
Yeah.
So it's just not, one size does not fit all.
Right.
Yeah. I just, I felt strongly about that. My character, I never wanted to be a snake oil salesman. I wanted to be a person that could offer something to the public that would produce a product like our engines that gives you longevity, durability, and performance. And that's why I decided to do the diesel additive.
No, it's perfect. We just did a test recently, had an independent lab do cetane testing, lubricity testing, base diesel plus additives. And what's in that bottle made a positive difference.
Yeah.
And that test is they take like a bearing surface or something and do a high.
So what you have is what's called a high frequency reciprocating rig. So that's the same test that they measure the minimum lubricity for diesel. And right down the street at the refinery, there's one of those devices running every day, because every time they're making a batch of fuel, they're measuring the fuel as a quality control. They're measuring the wear scar size. And the smaller the wear scar, the better the lubricity is for the diesel.
Right.
And that's how they judge that.
Yeah. Cool. That's fascinating. Any questions for us? We'll turn the tables here.
Oh, wow. I wasn't ready for that. Now you caught me off guard, right? I'm
dude,
using people asking me questions.
Dude, he's smarter than us, dude. He's going to ask me something. I'm going to be like, well,
easy questions. Easy questions.
Well, how often do you see diesel engines that have EGR system issue? Like it's not internal mains, rods, all the hard part stuff is okay, but it's all the extra stuff.
We love it.
Well,
I'm going to say that must be often then.
We say that jokingly, that we love it because it keeps us very busy. I mean, people are getting fault codes for restricted EGR and everything like that. And so it unfortunately, but also beneficially, keeps our mechanics very busy.
A lot of people,
we see it a lot.
A lot of people out there, all the comments are, just delete it, straight pipe it, do all this stuff. Okay, so let me say this. I'm a grandpa, not a great grandpa, but I'm a grandpa. I want my earth to be as clean as possible for my grandchildren, for my little grandchildren. So I want technology and our environment to be as clean as possible. But I am convinced by working on these cars or trucks mostly for most of my life that there's a better way to do this. That's what I'm challenging the scientists and stuff. And like Chris Parkhurst at Speed of Air, they're doing testing with United Engine Machine and CARB, and they have found a way to eliminate in a diesel. Now, again, I'm not going to speak about gas engines right now. I'm going to talk about diesel engines. Some of the regurgitative, that's the word I want to use, the regurgitative systems that we have on a diesel is damaging a diesel engine. It's creating a lot of soot. I mean, we pull the intakes off these 6.7s or the Eco Diesel and things like that. It's even any engine.
It's suffocating.
It's suffocating. I mean, I pulled apart a Cummins before to do a Banks air intake. And I mean, you're like, how did this engine even run? I mean, you're like,
You know, I mean, sometimes you got like a half inch, an inch of carbon buildup.
Now you can going to direct injection. How many times do we have a car come in and it's got these weird drivability issues, and we really don't have any check engine lights or anything? And what do we do? I say borescope the intake. Go back. We gotta have to look at the intake, because I'm thinking the way this thing and the people are saying it's icky and it's not performing the way it used to.
Has trouble starting when it's cold.
You run a borescope down that intake, man, and I mean, you're just looking at nothing but, you can't even see the intake valves.
Right.
And all this regurgitative stuff going on. And that's what I'm, if I could do one thing before I die, it would be to figure out a way to eliminate an EGR system. So, because I see it causing more damage to engines. I believe that it's causing more damage to these engines than anything else that I see, except lack of maintenance, guy running out of oil and things like that. But if you really
never doing oil changes, I
mean, that's a whole nother discussion, like my t-shirt says, do your maintenance, dang it, I'm busy. But I think the EGR, I mean, Chris he's produced numbers. Have you heard about some of these opacity numbers? Did I say the word right? Opacity?
One of those two.
One of those.
Tribology.
Yeah. But they've done the same engine, just changed out the pistons, done nothing else, no tunes, no nothing, and they went from like a 28, 29 opacity to
I think it was like
1 to 2, which means basically we got no particulates coming out of the exhaust at the manifold, and it's lowering exhaust temperatures, and that's what EGR is supposed to do and things like that. So. Did I answer your question? I am so against EGR, but what I'm not against is scrapping everything so that we have a dirty environment. I don't want that.
There's got to be a better way.
There's that, and that's what I want. It's science. I want the science to catch up, and I think the science has to be in the combustion chamber, because that's where it's all happening.
Well, combustion chamber, and let me ask you as well, since you're an oil guy, in the oil as well. Here's an education thing that I need to clarify for myself is, does the oil affect the amount of soot buildup that, as it's recirculating?
Good question.
No, it shouldn't. That should not be factoring in.
How do you feel about the EGR? Give it to me.
It hurts the oil, right? Because when you start breathing back what you just exhausted,
sucking your farts.
Right.
That's what people like to call it.
That's what I was thinking too. I just wasn't going to say it.
Well, I did. There you go.
There you go. So when you're doing that, it's just not good. So fuel is the enemy of the oil. When you're putting junk back in the combustion chamber, some of that's going to get past the rings and it's going to get into the oil. So it's not beneficial for oil life that way, because you're going to load this up. But when the dispersants are doing their job, the soot that got into the oil should be suspended in the oil. That should not be able to get out.
Unless you're using the incorrect type of oil.
Oh, and to increase that, we just spoke about it, a bypass oil filter to help capture it.
If you can get some of that soot out there, I mean, again, there's other little things that could factor in terms of the volatility of the oil, in that oil vapor getting out. So when you have a higher volatility oil, you could get more oil evaporation into the PCV system, into that stuff. So that could have it. That's really more through the crankcase ventilation, you could get more oil vapor that could help bind the soot and create more deposit issues that way. So, I mean, again, this is all. You'd have to have some real testing to say, okay, if we went from this chemistry oil to that chemistry of oil over a set runtime and conditions, does that limit the amount of deposit buildup in the intake manifold? That would be something you have to test and see.
Right.
There's so many tests I think about. I mean, here's one of the next tests that I'm in my mind. I'm like thinking, okay, I want to do this. We've proven with science that idling your truck is not a good idea.
40%.
For the engine. Mm-hmm. But we really haven't, I mean, we're talking about it now. We haven't even dived into what's better for the after treatment, because that's really expensive. What is better? In my mind, I haven't proven it, but in my mind, I'm thinking, and we did speak about it earlier, idling creates soot, colder temperatures and things like that. And so you
have to regen more often.
The
more often you regen, the more fuel you're using.
Yeah.
The more fuel dilution happens in the oil.
Yeah.
But some engines are worse than others in terms of where their strategy for getting the fuel into the exhaust to burn off the DPF can be problematic.
I think what I'm going to do, I'm thinking out loud here, my test on that is when we have our DPF machine, cleaner here, is we're going to set up a test where I'm idling a truck for a long time, at a certain a time, and then I'm going to go out and drive that truck, and then I'm going to check the flow rate. I'll clean the DPF, get a baseline, idle it for 10 hours or something like that, and then drive it for 10 hours, and then check
over a number of days, and
then check that. But I mean, my brain tells me there's no way that it's better. It just isn't. But I want to do the science. Yeah.
The more complete combustion you have, the less soot you have. So the filter will be cleaner.
Yeah.
The theory is
all the brains at the table are in agreement on this. I think. Yeah.
Well, it's back to, can you determine, we'll call it a maintenance schedule or an operating procedure that can move the needle on that? Yeah, the science will hold up in that the particulate filter is just that. It's there to catch particulate. Anything the more complete the combustion is, the less particulate there's going to be.
Yeah.
But sometimes when you have that, back to why is there an EGR on there? If particulate was the only thing, well, when you have that higher combustion temperature that generates less particulate, it generates more NOx.
Right.
NOx emissions. So you're trading off. That's the issue. There's all these trade-offs. Is that, if I reduce NOx, then I generate more soot. But now that I generated more soot, now I need to have a filter. It's that old kid's book. If you give a mouse a cookie, that's what's happening with all this stuff. Is like we've got this engine that runs just fine. Oh man, the sulfur in the fuel is causing acids. Let's get rid of the sulfur in the fuel. Then we won't have acids anymore. Then the engine can live longer. Okay, great, we did that. But
now our pumps are dying because I've got no lubricity.
Right, so now I got to go put this stuff in there. Yeah. Well, but don't put too much stuff in there because now it's going to generate more.
We call that chasing your tail from where, chasing your tail.
That's what we have to do.
Or give the mouse a cookie. Chris Barker at Speed of Air says, the alphabet soup. You just keep adding and adding. You're mixing all the stuff together.
Well, this has been great, man.
Lake, thank you so much. Your knowledge, I think, is so valuable to such a large audience because, again, everybody's using the technology that you're talking about in some shape or form. And so really, our hearts go out to you. Thank you so much.
I'm happy to be the guy sitting on the camera and talking to you guys, but please understand that it's not me just saying these things. You guys like Mark Malberg, you've already mentioned, Billy Godbold, Mike Mucha, who's my mentor from Lubrizol. There's a army of people behind me that have helped all of this be possible. I'm just the guy that gets to be on camera and talk about it.
Yeah. Well, I feel the same way.
Thank you so much. This is our episode here at the Builders Lounge. We're happy to have you guys. We'll see you next time.